Good morning. How's everybody doing? Thanks for spending this time with me. I love that Donalyn Miller has called it the pajama PD. And let's keep going with that energy. Donalyn got us speaking a little bit about engaging students with books. Thanks, Donalyn, for all of that. And let's keep going with the idea of how we might continue engaging our students with kind of curiosity, self-directing their own learning, and kind of puzzling over this idea of enjoying the madness of our classrooms, since our classrooms are such unique communities. And so this morning, I'm going to challenge us to think a little bit, whether we've been in the classroom for many years or just a few months or days even. It's unique, our profession, is that we get to start new every single year. And so we can kind of outgrow and think some of our best strategies in terms of how are we using tools to help us manage our classrooms. So we're going to take a little look at that this morning, and we're going to start by studying kind of 3 tools that I've been thinking about with folks like yourselves in the field. If at any time you have a question during our time together, please feel free to tweet it out, and I'll find some stopping points to think a little bit with you of your questions. And I'd love to kind of engage and interact with you in that way. And as you try things, keep tweeting those things out well beyond our time together this morning. Okay, so I have to start with a little bit of a story. I recently was traveling, and I spent some time in an airport. And needless to say, it was a little bit of a chaotic experience in an airport. And chaos tends to bring, for me anyway, stress. I didn't know where the lines were formed. I felt like there actually was no line. There was a little bit of kind of shoving, trying to get to the right gate. And so I couldn't help but thinking, why wasn't there a better system in place for helping passengers like me and my fellow passengers know exactly where to go in order to board this flight? So of course, everything in my life tends to come back to our classrooms. And it made me think a little bit about this idea of chaos and structure in our classrooms, and how we work really hard to avoid the chaos, and we work really hard to create structures. And so that kind of prompted a little bit of brain research with my colleagues and I at Growing Educators. And we were thinking, we found a little bit of work from Judy Willis. Many of you might know her. She is a neurologist who's kind of turned educator. And it's interesting if we think a little bit about how the brain works. Many of us know, I actually didn't know this, that there's a section of the brain called the amygdala. And in our terms, in terms for today, the amygdala basically is a control center. And imagine when that control center is stress-free, it allows the neurology of our brain to function normally. And lots of learning can happen in our classrooms. When this control center is scrambled, stress may cause that scramble to happen. It basically shuts down all the neurology pathways. And imagine in our classroom, neurology pathways are blocked. That transforms into perhaps some management roadblocks we need to face. In animals, this center is the fight or flight capacity. And in nature, we would probably all agree that that's a good thing, that animals can fight or flight their way through their environments. However, I would probably beg to argue that we would all say that we don't want our students fighting or flighting in our classroom. So it feels like when we are really strategic about our classroom environment, the amygdala is calm and many, many brain waves and paths are open for learning. And so it's interesting to think, have I kind of considered this idea of how my classroom might actually help cause, help decrease any of that chaos that might be happening in our brains? Do I have systems in place that are empowering students to be in charge of their self-directed learning, to enable them to be curious, to enable them to be engaged? which leads us a little bit into the second half of our title, which is, what does it really mean to be a critical strategic thinker? If you think for just a minute how that term critique or critical is used in your everyday lives, and perhaps if even be aware of the weight that it may hold. And just take a second to think, how is that used even in my community or even in my own personal life? What does it really mean to you to be critical? It might, to some people, mean the ability to analyze content. Seeing perhaps multiple sides of a concept. It might mean that it's evaluative. It might mean that I'm able to interpret and see things in my own way. It could be a myriad of things, of this idea of critical. And I can't help but wonder in the field of education if critical has a negative or a positive connotation. It might be something to think about with your colleagues. I'd like us to think that there's a healthy connotation to critical. This idea that it might be interesting to think first what critical is not. We want to think that critical is not merely just being compliant, right? As teachers, as students, as members of society, it's not necessarily feedback without support. I feel like would not necessarily be critical. And sometimes, I know I've used this before, when I say stop being so critical, it feels like I'm being picked on, but we have to be careful that being critical isn't really picking, nor is it really one-sided. It would be interesting to think a little bit about what critical means kind of in our everyday lives, and then what does it actually mean when it comes to teaching our students to be critical individuals, and not only individuals, but critical thinkers. I'd like to think more of like being critical means that we're really dynamic in our learning. It's an ongoing process. I'd like to think that maybe it's evolving. Could we consider the process of thinking critically in a mindful growth set rather than a fixed growth set, right? Like Dweck kind of encourages to think of, and it's constant analysis. Let's consider all of these criteria, and I'm sure much more, on kind of 3 levels. Maybe we think a little bit of our students' like just lives in general, and then perhaps what does it mean to take this to my learning, and what does it mean to take this to our relationships? So it's interesting to think, is my classroom one that's fostering this critical thinking, and perhaps what are the layers of critical thinking that we're thinking about? I do think that we could be interesting to think, what are the strategic structures that we have in place that are allowing that amygdala to flow freely so that our kids can have multiple layers of the idea of being a critical person. I think the payoff is huge, and we see it throughout our teaching careers, because we're not just teaching students to exist in our classrooms. I think we're teaching them to actually have a life of being a critical thinker. And when our kids have that idea of, I am critical of my life, I think they can take it to their relationships, and then ultimately I think they can take it to their learning and their world. It's interesting to think about, if we position ourselves to think about being critical in this way, just take a minute here before we get into our major content, the idea of, imagine this playing out in your classroom this week. If a student has the ability to be critical about their life, it might mean that they've been given the tools to know when frustration is about to happen. It might mean that they have the tools to realize, I'm feeling like I need a break. And when they need a break, our classroom is designed perhaps for them to take that break. Imagine how that would play out in their relationships. Imagine how it would play out in their learning. So I'd just like to assert that idea of what does it mean to be critical has multiple lenses. And I think I'd like to assert and study that with you today, because I'm thinking a lot lately that management isn't really just a band-aid fixing temporary roadblocks, let's instead think of management of kind of positioning kids to really kind of learn about who they are, so they have a mindfulness of their own learning journey. And I guess I'm asserting the idea that our classrooms can actually set up this structure for our kids to be self-directed, curious, engaged, and mindful about their lives, their relationships, and their learning. Some educators tend to jump right to the learning, which I understand why. And the kind of work the Common Core is asking our students to do can't be done without a curriculum of thinking and mindfulness and critique. But I'd like to suggest that if we jump right to the learning and we forget to think a little bit about the relationships that our kids are in and kind of their self-awareness, it might be a little bit of a Band-Aid fix. So I guess I'm asserting that let's avoid faux management strategies. I'm sure all the management strategies that we're working on are great, but that idea of faux management is interesting. We don't want to just manage on the surface. We're really looking for like deep structure. A good friend of mine, Dr. Gravity Goldberg, said something to me the other day. She said, you don't necessarily go to the hardware store to buy a drill. You go to the hardware store because you need to put a hole in the wall. And so I thought a little bit about that, of things in my life that I'm kind of putting quick fixes on and things in my life that I'm kind of working through the deep structure. So let's just think about our classroom management in that way, and maybe it helps us kind of position ourselves a little bit differently. So let's think a little bit about the main, I guess I'm suggesting a couple of tools to think about, and today I want to talk about 3 of them with you. I want to think a little bit first, I would say. One tool that I think might be interesting for us to think a little bit about is how are we using our environment as a tool? Again, this is fascinating that every year we get a chance to start new. And so if you were to think of your classroom floor plan right now, even though if it's already set up, and I'm sure it's set up gorgeous and beautifully and strategic, I almost think of those pages from an encyclopedia when I was a kid that had a blank body. And remember those cellophane kind of layers that had the nervous system and then the muscle system and the skeleton system? That's kind of how I'm picturing this image, is kind of imagine your classroom. And if you have a notebook, you might even sketch out the parameters of your classroom or your dream classroom. And then let's today, this morning, as our time together, almost imagine layering those kind of see-through sections of your classroom on top of each layer and see what we come up with. So in our classroom environment, I'm thinking a lot about floor plan considerations. And you might already have something like this already sketched out. I know I always enjoy doing it in the classroom, and I love supporting classroom teachers currently in my job. Lots of principals and coaches and teachers right now in the field are discussing management. I think this time of the year it's fairly appropriate as we launch into our year. It feels like our management structure lays the foundation of an exciting year ahead. But the kids can't handle that load of our academia until foundation has been set. So really smart to think a little bit about management right now with your colleagues. So you've got your floor plan drawn in your notebook. And let's think a little bit right now about some major spaces in your classroom. The first thing I like to think about, actually not first necessarily, is the idea of what kinds of work spaces do we have in our classroom. I think a couple different aspects of workspaces. I think of there's got to be perhaps space in that first layer of places for our kids to gather as a whole group. This idea of a whole group gathering space sometimes kind of sets the notion that we are a team. We're thinking together, our energy is together, and the payoff as a teacher is I can assess quickly what students are thinking when they're close to me. So the idea of a large gathering space for kind of group gathering work might be one layer you add to your floor plan. I'd also want to think a little bit about small group spaces. Are there spaces in your floor plan where kids might be able to gather together in small groups? Sometimes that small group space encourages a little bit more risk-taking. And when you're thinking about your workspace, I can't help but think about furniture. Now, I realize that some of us don't have the benefit or the opportunity to pick or select the furniture in our classroom, but check out these round tables in an 8th grade classroom. When you walk into this classroom, the energy is incredibly different. It sets up the ability to make eye contact, to lean in, to discuss, to keep one another accountable, and a little bit of that social piece that our students are craving and working on in their critical thinking and their critical stance. So it is interesting to think a little bit about your furniture. Even the placement of furniture is interesting to think about in your workspace. Some students like to be low to the ground. Some students like to be high to standing. I think lowering and lifting levels of your workspace could be pretty interesting to think about. You also perhaps want to think a little bit about individual space. Actually, this is another example of some workspace with lower level seating that students might choose to work. It's interesting to think a little bit again of like kind of the energy that you're thinking about in your workspace. Another space you might consider is your teacher space, right? There's one of you and maybe 36 bodies, but you still need to have a teacher space. And my encouragement and recommendation would be the idea that teacher workspace needs to be pretty, I would say you don't really necessarily want it to move. Can you imagine moving your teacher space every time you had to teach? So teacher workspace might be something to think about, kind of creating spaces around your teach space. So I'm going to take a couple seconds just to let you work on your floor plan for a second and think a little bit about these, like your couple of different workspaces, kind of in those cellophane layers. Check in, do I have whole group space, and would I want to have whole group space? What would be the benefit of having small group space design in your work group, in your workspace? What would be the benefit of having individual space, and have I considered teacher space kind of in an equitable way, considering I'm one and I have 36 students? A teacher we work with in Los Angeles has helped us kind of think through a little bit about this idea of materials in your space. Many of us may be working in neighborhoods where students come from a lower socioeconomic background. And it might be worth our thinking a little bit about, have I created a space in my classroom where they feel they can keep their own materials? For some of our students, they don't have that space at home. And imagine what that might do to the learning environment if they had their own space. So a second place to think a little bit, or an additional place to think a little bit about in your floor plan is, do I have spaces for materials? And am I going to choose to have those materials be a community materials? I might have a mixture of community materials, and I might have a space where students keep their individual materials. Imagine what that might do and what message that might send for students if we have both. And then, just like me standing in the airport, I was wishing that there were kind of a directive of where the lines were to go. Imagine the same applies to materials. Do students know where the math materials are? Do they know exactly where any kind of material they might need to exist in the time of the day? So I think a little bit about kind of accessibility to materials, labeling of materials, and even getting students in on helping with both of those processes. Something else you might want to think a little bit about, after materials, in your floor plan, check out traffic patterns. So you've got your spaces carved out, right? You've got your whole group space, your small group space, your independent space, your teacher space, your material space, perhaps. In all that space carved out, what exactly and how exactly are students moving to and from those spaces? It might be worth to take a peek at the rendering of your classroom floor plan to see, do I have traffic patterns that enable students to move freely in and out of all these spaces I've just created? The last category of classroom floor plans I like to think about is the fancy up portion. I do really recognize it in classrooms, and I'm constantly amazed and inspired by all the work you do to fancy up your classroom space, making that space feel comfortable so that students are able to kind of take risks because their brains are settled. But I love all the work that you're doing out in the field in terms of fancying up your floor space. So fancying up could mean kind of labeling your materials, bringing in a little touch of style, and then bringing kids in on kind of the organization of that fancy up is really helpful as well. So that you don't want to necessarily be the only manager of your classroom. Perhaps students are able to take a role and kind of helping their classroom feel like it's their own style. So take a look at the floor plan rendering that you're continuing to create. So you've got some whole group spaces, you've got some traffic spaces, you've got places you've fancied up. The last thing I'd like to talk about today, just for our environment piece, is how have we introduced the idea of choice? And perhaps do we want to introduce the idea of choice? Donalyn spoke a little bit about the power of choice when we get kids thinking strategically about their reading. What would happen if we did that same thing in our classroom management? I wonder how our classroom would feel if we set up structures for kids to make choices in terms of the environment. I wonder what it would feel like if our kids were able to choose the space they worked in for the different parts of our day. I imagine some of our students have different energy towards different parts of our day. I wonder what students' anxieties levels feel like during math or science or social studies or writing or reading. If you scanned through your class roster right now, it would be interesting to see what it would feel like to kind of rate anxiety levels in every part of your day for individual students. And would choice in their workspace help calm down some of those stress levels that might be being experienced? So I'd like to assert perhaps this idea of offering kids and teaching students the power of choice when selecting their workspace. It might not be something you do as a whole class. It might be individual by individual or pulling some kids together in a small group, or it might in fact be talking as a whole class and putting on the table the idea that everyone's brain works differently, and a way we're going to honor that in this classroom is we're going to think a little bit about how this classroom can be used as a tool to honor the different parts of the brain. Maybe some of our students like to stand while they deliver their math or while they work on their math. Maybe some students, like in this photo, like to snuggle in a corner in a nook with their book. And it might even change depending on the type of genre work. Some kids, when they're reading fiction, like to kind of snuggle into a reading nook, and some kids, when they're reading information, like to be at a table where they can respond or be ready to talk to a partner. So that's something to think a little bit about in terms of using the environment floor plan as a tool to help us manage our classrooms. I'm willing to bet that many of us have thought of our environment and our floor plan and our space and our traffic patterns and our materials and our choices initially, but let's encourage one another to take a deeper look at that structure to think, are we setting kids up to use our classroom structure as a tool to manage their self-awareness, their relationships, and therefore their learning? So your rendering may have some considerations for floor plan space, for traffic patterns, where am I fancying up, and for choice. The next kind of big container that I like to think through with teachers and educators is our charts. And our friends Christy Mraz and Margie Martinelli have done an incredible job of teaching and empowering us in terms of our smarter charts. And so for this section, it is important to think a little bit about, and to kind of continue growing that work that Christy and Marjorie have done, is that we just like to think about charts as a tool in our classroom management, rather than kind of just a poster or a decoration. So a couple things to think about in our charts is, do we have charts that are process-oriented or product-oriented, and which one would help students engage in their own self-starting learning? Do our charts foster inquiry? Are they usable, and are they student-centered? Might be a short list to think about as you mentally scan right now the walls of your classroom. It might be interesting to think about, do I have a diversity in terms of charts supporting students to become critical, curious thinkers? So we like to think about process charts in our classroom that students can actually use as a tool. This is an example of a writing process in one of our Los Angeles schools. And you can see the level of the chart is eye level with students. It's just on closets. And you'll often see students moving to and from this chart to help them get self-started. So you can almost imagine your charts in your classrooms being an additional teacher. Are charts portable? Might be something to think about. Can students move the charts if they in fact move from one space to another in their classroom? This is a portable chart that is helping students think about their word study inquiry. Do charts foster inquiry? And I think charts with sticky notes are great, that students can interact with charts. And a lot of teachers in classrooms in Los Angeles here pose really big inquiry questions that students can add and take to as their learning evolves. I love this example of partnership charts as a tool that's portable and usable for kids. These are just construction paper folded in half that kids keep in their books, either as a bookmark or in their reading folders, and they just grab the chart when they sit with their partner, and it's a reminder of the teaching that's been done. Process charts, inquiry charts, usable friendly charts, portable charts. These are all things we'd want to think about when designing the walls of our classroom to be a tool to help us manage strategic thinking and self-starting. So take a second again to look at your rendering, or just mentally scan the walls of your classroom and think a little bit about these two big ideas we have on the table. How am I using my classroom environment to help me think through as a tool to manage students? And how am I using the walls of my classroom as a tool to help structure a place where kids can be curious, strategic, and critical? We can't get our kids to that thinking until the foundation has been built and those stress levels have been reduced in that amygdala. So while you're scanning your room in your mind or looking at your rendering, you might also think a little bit about how you might study this with your colleagues. Is it something that you might, as a team, tour your building together and grow some thinking together around it? Thanks so much for your thoughts. Yes, thanks. Amy, thinking a little bit about rating anxiety is an interesting way to think a little bit about helping our students use our classroom, which makes me think a little, I've been in some classrooms where there actually is a pacing zone for students when they feel like they need to calm down. I really like that idea of carving out actual physical space inside the classroom. I know some teachers have kids exit the classroom, but there's something about staying in the community and working through your anxiety I feel is really strategic. So imagine, I know we don't always have a lot of real estate to deal with our floor plans, but is there space that kids could walk out their stress if they needed to? Is there a quiet space where no one will interfere with students if they need to kind of just work out their anxiety level? And then imagine again, the payoff is when we have those spaces created in our classroom, we can really set kids up to be in that critical stance and take a risk for their learning. Let's take a look at our last big container for today. Is a little bit thinking a little bit about our planning, right? So I almost think of management in a couple of layers. We have like our external planning, and then we have kind of like the internal deep-rooted planning. So our planning of our environment and then our planning of our curriculum is a third tool I'd like to talk with you a little bit about this morning. So are we using our planning as a strategic tool? Planning is probably, I think, one of the most exciting parts of being an educator, but it can also be really frustrating. So it might be helpful to think of your planning in layers as well. Do I have a year-long plan, and what would the benefit of that be? Do I have a way of planning a unit of study that's fairly predictable? And then something to think about, again, in some of our schools in Los Angeles, we've really been thinking a little bit about strategic test-taking planning so that test-taking doesn't monopolize our curriculum. As educators, we do always know that we either have a district benchmark or we have a national benchmark that we're thinking about, but we want to avoid that monopolizing our curriculum. So it might be interesting to think a little bit about, do I have spaces in my planning to kind of insert a little bit of test prep so that I can stay true to the planning that my students really deserve in terms of our genre and inquiry work. So a lot of teachers are thinking a little bit about their year-long teaching. This happens to be a sample from a Los Angeles classroom of how the writing text types are playing out in terms of unit of study. So what you're seeing is that these teachers have worked hard to translate a text type of the Common Core into a genre study. And so that narrative text type is showing up twice on this calendar for a personal narrative and then also a fairy tale narrative. And what you see in pink there is that example of some strategic test prep, so that I don't have to sacrifice an actual writing or reading or math unit for a test prep. I'm going to stay true to it in its curriculum and its content, but then I am going to give my kids a little bit of test-taking practice on that unit immediately following. And so I think when teachers have a year-long vision or a year-long plan at a glance, it actually lowers our stress level because we know exactly the syllabus that we're going to follow. And it might even be interesting to let kids in on this syllabus. I know when I was in school or when I take classes, there is something about that syllabus handed to me on the very first day where it feels calming. It might change, of course, but I know there's a predictability. I know that my course of study has been thought out. And it's almost a sense of kind of taking care of our students. So you might think, like, with my colleagues, do I have protocols for each content or discipline that I'm studying, my math, my history, my science, my social studies, my reading, my writing, my technology, and then what's the curriculum of thinking that I've got woven throughout all of that? This curriculum, though, remember, keep in mind, is not necessarily going to be at its best until we have that foundation of the structure of management in place. This is an example of a little bit of what some teachers have done here in Los Angeles, the idea of where do we have our strategic test prep in place. This way we know for sure we're going to teach kids to do perhaps some prompt writing, as an example here in writing, only in the pink. We're not necessarily going to teach kids to write to a prompt during a regular writing time. We're going to let the process do its work, because we know that choice is really important to kids as they're learning through the process. You might also think a little bit, do I have a template that I'm following for each unit of study? And again, I'm using writing this morning as an example, but this is some work our team has done around helping teachers kind of really study a process of writing. And so each different color sticky represents a different part of the process. that's going to be replicated in every single unit of study. The teaching points are going to change based on what you're learning about your students. But this predictability, you can imagine, lowers anxiety when students know the course. It also lowers anxiety of teachers. I know exactly what's going to happen, and I don't have to scramble. So think a little bit about this idea of planning as a way to think through a tool being a tool for management. Do I have structures in place that might help me think about planning as a tool for management? As I'm talking, I'm thinking of even another layer of planning, right? You have your day-to-day planning, might also be another layer. So if we go broad, I have a year plan, I have a unit plan, and then my day-to-day is thought out in terms of when am I giving kids a brain break? When am I giving kids a chance to move around the classroom? When am I giving kids a chance to talk? When am I giving kids a chance to be by themselves? So that daily planning is probably equally as important to kind of big picture curriculum planning. So we've talked a little bit about this idea of our environment can be a tool to support strategic management. Our charts can be a tool to support strategic management. And our curriculum planning can be a tool to support strategic management. The final thing, if I could, I perhaps want to think a little bit with you about something that's not on this list. So when we get a chance to come back together again, I would say one more layer of strategic classroom management is looking at the language that you're designing in your classroom. So the language that I'm using with students, the language that students are using with students, might actually transfer into the language that students are using with themselves. And so Peter Johnston and many of our inspiring mentor educators really help us think a little bit about that last category of language. Could really be a really valuable tool in thinking a little bit about our classroom management. This is just a short list of some tools to think about our classroom management. I really do want to encourage you to continue studying this in whatever phase of your career you are in, whether it's been teaching for 2 days, 2 months, 25 years. I think we have an incredible opportunity to outgrow our best practices and really think through how is our classroom management setting up environments where kids can think through being a critical individual and being self-aware of themselves, their relationships, and their learning. I think this is important, not only that they have a self-awareness, but I think maybe even more importantly, we want our kids to feel that they're change agents in those layers. Our kids feel that they're change agents for themselves, their relationships, their learning, and ultimately the world around them. I think a lot of this work in our classrooms, a lot of literacy work, a lot of math work is really just good life work. And so I'm hoping that we can think a little bit about these tools of our classroom environment, our charts, our planning, and our language to make the best possible classrooms for one another. I hope I get a chance to study with you again in the future. Let me know what you're trying out, send pictures, tweet them out, and let's continue studying this idea so that we're creating the best opportunities for our students to become lifelong learners. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your pajama PD. And thanks to the Educator Collaborative. I'm really looking forward to a year of study with you. Take care.